Hey, if we've never met before, my name's Derrick. I'm so glad that you're here. I serve here as the lead pastor, and if you're new with us, you're joining us in the middle of this series that we've been in now for several weeks called The Whole Story, where we are walking week by week through the Bible one book at a time, and we are doing our best to get at this one question. Every time we open the text, every time we open the scriptures, we want to ask the question, where does this moment or this story, where does it sit in the larger narrative, the story that God is telling? Because the Bible, as we've said, isn't this collection of random spiritual truths. It's not this disconnected series of lessons. It's this long, overarching narrative that is actually still being written. And when we drop randomly into any section of the scriptures without really knowing where it sits in the larger narrative, it can be so confusing. And so the Bible Project video just did an awesome job kind of recapping where we've been so far. And last week, Pastor Kristen preached a brilliant message on the first section of Exodus. And today we're going to step into the second half of Exodus, chapters 19 through 40. But we really, as we open the book of Exodus, even last week, I think we see that this person has become a people, the people that God has entrusted his blessing to so that they could be a blessing to the nations. But now, centuries later, or generations later, after Exodus opens, we see those people with the blessing in slavery. And we're faced with this question and this tension. If God promised blessing, then why are his people under oppression? And we see this in the opening book, in the opening chapters of Exodus. His people, for years and years and years, long suffering with labor and slavery in the heat of the day. And we see that these people, after so much time being under oppression, they actually aren't even crying out to God with eloquent prayers. They haven't created a robust theology or understanding of who God is. They haven't even apologized for anything that maybe had gotten them into the situation in the first place. It just says that they groaned. And that God heard their groans and responded. And I think that this tells us something about the character of God and about the nature of this story. That rescue does not begin with human merit. It begins with God's divine compassion. It doesn't begin with something they did to earn it or to expect it, but it just comes because God so chooses. It's not because they even have this robust understanding of who God is, but more so because God has a deep knowledge and understanding of who they are. And despite knowing that, chooses to rescue. Kristen talked last week about the word yada. It says he knew. He knew them at this intimate level. And even in knowing everything about them, he still chose to rescue. Eventually, the story becomes really dramatic, and Moses confronts Pharaoh, and the plagues dismantle every sense of power that can be achieved by human might. They kind of tear all of those power structures down, and then after Passover, we see the Israelites walk out of oppression. And we see in one moment, in one day, 400 years of slavery ends. And at the same time, after Passover, as they are walking into their freedom, perhaps one of the most honest moments in the scriptures takes place. It says that they reached the edge of the Red Sea. They were walking into their freedom, but Pharaoh is pursuing them. And even though they have been liberated, they have been spared, they have just watched all of these miracles of the plagues do the most incredulous, ridiculous, crazy things you could even imagine. They have seen the power of God. They're standing at the edge of the Red Sea, which seems to be the only thing standing between them and their freedom. And they cry out with this in Exodus 14. They say, was it because there was no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. And then all of a sudden, even after they grumble, after they complain, after they wish they would have died in captivity, it says the seas opened up and they walk through walls of water. It's one of the most epic stories in all of the Bible. These breathtaking moments. And as the last person steps onto the other side of the Red Sea, it says the sea closes on itself and it gobbles up Pharaoh and all of his chariots. And the miracle was amazing. They are now on dry ground, on the other side of their freedom. And you would think, looking after all that God had done, that they would have cried out and said, "We made it!" But just a few days later, they say this in Exodus 16. "If only we had died in Egypt. There we had food. You have brought us into the desert to starve." And honestly, as obnoxious and as annoying as this story seems as it's unfolding, it shouldn't be that surprising to us. Because sometimes people we love, we stay in these unhealthy environments or relationships, not because they're life-giving, but because they are familiar. And sometimes we stay in these patterns of hurt just because they feel predictable. The Israelites, at this moment in their story, they're not longing for slavery itself. They're longing for familiarity, for predictability. See, Egypt may have been cruel, but at least it was known. And I want us to understand this juxtaposition between these two cries out from the Israelites. See, at the edge of the Red Sea, yes, they are afraid of dying. Pharaoh's army is behind them, and they are assuming that rescue has failed, and this is panic. But I believe that in the next story, on the other side of the Red Sea, their fear begins to change. They're no longer afraid of death, but they are terrified of a new way of living. In the wilderness, their fear changes. They're no longer trapped, but now they're worried about food and water and about tomorrow. See, at the edge of the Red Sea, their question was, can God save us? And on the other side of the Red Sea, the question became, will God take care of us? The first fear, it doubts God's power. But the second fear, it doubts God's goodness. And the second fear, that second question, it runs deep, doesn't it? And so we see unfolding in the story in the wilderness, it becomes something much more than a place. It is a training ground. God does not abandon them, but he stays with them day by day. Each morning it talks about manna, bread that appears on the ground. Only enough for that day and no more. And they cannot secure their own security by storing it up or by saving it for later. They have to simply wake up each morning and trust again. See, God rescues them quickly at the Red Sea, but he forms them slowly in the wilderness. Why? Because getting Israel out of Egypt only took one day, but getting Egypt out of Israel took 40 years. And this is the strange thing about us. This is the strange thing about human nature. When people live inside of systems long enough, even harmful ones, even damaging ones, freedom can feel terrifying. It can feel threatening. Researchers have observed that some prisoners released after decades will intentionally commit small crimes so that they can return. After the Korean War, some prisoners of war resisted repatriation for similar reasons. Psychologists call this learned dependency. An environment shapes instincts so deeply that a person no longer knows how to live outside of it. We even see this in animals. We see this with elephants. When they're young and they're in captivity, they put a strong chain to an immovable object. And it trains them at a young age that they cannot break free from that chain. And as elephants get older and they get bigger and stronger, they use a small, tiny rope to remind them of how powerless they actually are. And even though they have the ability to pull tree trunks out of the ground, they do not even try. We are more formed by by how we live in than we realize. Exodus is not only about Pharaoh's chains. It is about the ropes that remain in the mind after the chains are gone. Israel has crossed the Red Sea, yes, but internally they are still living in Egypt. And if we're honest, so many times, so are we. We can be released or liberated from the thing that held us, yet still live as if those restraints are real. And often worse, we can fear tomorrow's loss while standing in today's provision. And so we return to old patterns of familiarity because it's comforting. The Israelites, they wake up day after day to miracle bread. Bread that they did not have to grow or grind or cook or bake or do anything to make it happen. Day after day, they wake up to this miracle bread. I'm sure it tasted better than the wafers in those cups. And yet, they doubt God's goodness and provision and presence. And what we see in the story of Exodus is that the wilderness is a masterclass in formation. Just last night, I was at home. My son Blake loves to ride e-bikes, and he's a great little mechanic because he's had to become one because he breaks everything he owns. And he's broken many e-bikes, but the kid's really sharp. He can tear an e-bike down and put it back together in like no time. And he's really, really good at it. And it's been really fun over the years to, what I've tried to practice with all of my kids, with any sort of skill, is kind of what I call the Jesus model of teaching. So it's I do, you watch, and then I do, you help, and then you do, I help, and then you do, I watch. And then you try to get to the point where you don't have to be there anymore because it's so time consuming. Dude, this is the goal, like jump out of the nest, right? And so last night we're in the garage, we're working on his broken e-bike, it's fixed, we're painting it, we're doing all this stuff. But we've had this dirt bike project that we've been kind of putting off for literally 2 years. And I'm like, buddy, we got to get after this. The kid is so capable of doing this job by himself. But last night he's like, Dad, will you help me? Will you help me? Will you help me? Will you help me? And I was a little bit annoyed because I had other stuff to do. I had to clean, we went surfing during the day, I had wetsuits to rinse out and surfboards to rinse, and I was trying to multitask. And I just couldn't understand why he needed me in the garage with him to help him to just remove some bolts and put some bolts in. There was nothing technical about it. And it took me until this morning to realize that all three of my kids and all of us in the way we relate to God is very similar. My kids will ask for help even when they don't need it. And what I've had to learn over time is that they don't actually want my help. They want the promise of the security that comes through my proximity. He just wanted me in the garage with him. Would you just be present while I do this? Can we do this together? And so as a dad, I'm always navigating what it's like to let go of the handlebars when you're running alongside of them without training wheels and saying, trust, you've got this. And also when to know it's right to just be in the room together because that's all they need. What we see in this story is God as this patient father. He's training the Israelites in the desert for what they will face in the promised land. And he is just patiently with them, walking with them, trying to teach them how to trust, trying to empower them, trying to help them understand what it looks like, what it means to live into the fullness of who they are, trusting in God's goodness. And they keep asking in different ways, are you really going to take care of us? Are you really here? And he only gives them enough for today so that trust can grow in preparation for what is about to come. And this whole story, this whole Exodus story, it reminds me it's perfect for this season of Lent that we're in right now. Season of Lent echoes the 40 days that Jesus spent in the wilderness. And it's a time for us to take on limitation, to give things up, not to impress God, but to be reminded of his goodness. And so we see this story being kind of lived out again. For 40 days, the church practices this limitation thing, to say no to some things. And it models what happened in the story where Jesus himself went into the wilderness. This is 1,400 years after the wilderness story we're in Exodus. But Jesus himself goes into the wilderness for 40 days, and he is tempted by the devil. Just make some bread, just have some bread, just here's the bread. You don't need to worry about it. And Jesus responds back to this story that we're in today, the Exodus story. And he says, man does not live on bread alone, but on the care and on the love and on the goodness that comes from the Father. And Jesus, we see in the wilderness, succeeds where Israel struggled. Not by avoiding weakness, but by entrusting himself to the Father within his weakness. See, the wilderness is not where God abandons us. The wilderness is where we learn that God is enough. Astronomers say that stars are always present in the sky. We just can't see them during the day because a brighter light hides them. Darkness doesn't create the stars. It reveals them. And the wilderness works the same way. It does not create God's presence, but it reveals it. And so we get to the point of the story where they're at Mount Sinai. It's an incredible story. And I want to notice something before we dig into some of the details. Back to where we began. Rescue had already happened by this point. They're on the other side of their freedom. They have been delivered from Egypt. They are not in captivity anymore. Rescue had already begun. And it's after that that God gives the law to a rescued people so that they can learn how to live free. And the commands, they teach them how to live as free people and how to relate with God and with one another and how to be set apart from the other nations. And when we locate ourselves in that story, we begin to see this pattern. God rescues first, then he reforms. God rescues first, and then he reforms. And the pace often feels slower than we want. Yet that slowness is intentional because trust cannot be forced or downloaded. It grows through repeated experience of God's faithfulness. And I think this means for us that seasons where faith feels uncertain or God feels quieter than we expect, these are not necessarily signs of distance from God. They may actually be the places where deeper formation is happening. And before a single command was given, before a single command was written, they did nothing to earn their freedom. He says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. And we see in this story unfolding this reality of identity before expectation. We see belonging before any behavior modification. We see these commands given on Mount Sinai, they retrain slavery-formed instincts. They teach them how to rest, how to treat power, how to care for the vulnerable. Because freedom, it requires a new imagination. And God is not giving them these laws or these instructions to constrict them. He's giving them so that they can be liberated. And it's right here in this story where God is downloading to Moses these new way of living. Remember, at this point, they are no longer afraid of dying. They are terrified about a new way of life. And right here in the story comes one of the most revealing moments. Moses goes up to Mount Sinai to meet with God. The mountain is covered with pillar of cloud and fire, another miracle. It's not like they can't see it. It's right there. And Moses is gone for longer than they'd like. They just are not satisfied with how long this is taking. And they panic. They don't know how long he's going to be. So in the absence of clarity, just make something up, because that feels good. They don't know what's happening. God suddenly feels distant and uninvolved, and everything's uncertain. And so they gather their gold and they melt it down and they form this calf. And they say this in Exodus 32:4. These are your gods, Israel, who brought you out of Egypt. Mountain's on fire. Moses is up there in the mountain. And they go, but this is the God. This golden calf. This is the one that brought us out of Egypt. It's one of the easiest moments in the Bible to judge. These idiots. What were they thinking? It feels so primitive. It feels so ridiculous. How do you walk through the Red Sea into the land of freedom? How do you watch bread fall from heaven and see God on the mountain in fire? And then, because you aren't satisfied with how long this is taking, bow down to a golden calf. It feels so distant from us until we realize that the story isn't mainly about a golden calf. It's about what people do when God feels distant and uncertainty grows. The calf gave them something visible, something immediate, something that they could control. It gave them something that they could see and touch when trust felt challenging. And if we're honest with ourselves, that instinct has not escaped us. It's just become less obvious sometimes. The New Testament actually names this very directly. In Colossians 3, Paul writes this. He says, since then you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature. Sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. That's a short list, by the way. It is not comprehensive. But this last line is striking. Greed is idolatry. Lust is idolatry. Impurity is idolatry. Sexual immorality is idolatry. Not temples, not golden calves, not things that we can necessarily see or make sense of or create on our own. Anything that we look to for security instead of God becomes an idol. Our idols just look different. They look like status or control, certainty or wealth or future savings or success or comfort or anything that we need to do and put in order in our lives so that we feel safe. And we build idols wherever trust feels uncertain. And Exodus is honest enough to tell us that freedom from Pharaoh can happen quickly. But freedom from idols takes time. And then there comes this really strange bunch of chapters full of stories of fabric and poles made of acacia wood. And it's very repetitive. And if you tried to read it this week and got through it, God bless you, because it is like, you already said this. We're doing it again. And it's a really strange part of Exodus with incredible detail. And page after page explaining fabrics and measurements and wood and gold. And we often skim it because it's just not that compelling. But if you pull out of it and you get out of the details, it's the climax of the story. See, when they were in captivity in Egypt, Pharaoh, he built store cities. I don't think it's necessarily because he needed all that storage. He just needed something for the slaves to do. It kept them busy. And they were remote. They were outside of the proximity of Pharaoh. He didn't want to be near them. He didn't want to be around them, but he wanted to control them. But now we see God himself is coming on in to proximity. God says, I'm going to build a tent so I can live with my people. Genesis began with God with his people, and then we separated ourselves because we wanted our own autonomy. And now we see unfolding in this story, God beginning to change that. He says, no. That is not the way it was meant to be. We were meant to be in communion with one another. I am going to come in proximity with you. And Exodus moves towards God dwelling with his people in the middle of all of their broken lives. And then centuries later, we see Jesus stepping into the fullness of God's story, of God coming to live in our midst. And he shows that God's work is not merely about liberating us or removing us from oppression or bondage, but it is about communion. It is about coming back together with God in a way that brings about intimacy and belonging. And so when we look at the story, we begin to see this pattern. God initiates rescue, then he patiently forms trust, then he aligns himself to us in relationship. He's summoning us, he's calling us back to himself. Which means if your faith feels slower than you want, if trust feels unfinished, you may not be behind. You may be in the wilderness where freedom becomes real. And so if you would just close your eyes, I want to invite you to consider, to contemplate, to reflect on this story and where you might be in the middle of it, or where this story might be in the middle of you. Pay attention this week as you grasp for control. Not with shame, but with curiosity. What areas of my life am I building idols in? Because the scriptures is showing us not only how God brings people out, but how he walks with them afterwards. So where can we notice God's activity, even in the midst of our own chaos? And I want you to be reminded that Israel escaped Egypt in a night. But Egypt didn't escape from within them for 40 years. And maybe that's where many of us live. Not in chains any longer, but still living like we are. Still believing that security comes from control. Still storing our worry about tomorrow while standing inside of today's provision. Still wondering if God is powerful enough. And really wondering, is God good? And the whole story keeps gently saying the same thing. The wilderness is not proof that God is distant. It is the place where he teaches us how near he already is. And so this week, when you get pulled towards fear, when uncertainty wins and you grasp for control, would you pause before you try to solve that on your own? And would you ask God, what are you teaching me to trust? God, what are you teaching me to trust right now? And slowly and patiently, as we stay in the story, and as we depend on God's faithfulness, my hope and prayer for all of us is that we would learn to trust. And so, God, we need you. And God, we need to learn how to trust you over and over again. Every day, Lord, would you help us to realize and make sense of the things that we are doing that stand in the way of that. And God, would it be not by our might or our power, but by the power that comes from your Holy Spirit that would help us step into the freedom that you have for us. We pray this in your name, Jesus. Amen. Amen. Would you stand and worship with us?